The evening air hung heavy with the scent of coming rain as Officer Tom Bailey drove his patrol car down Maple Street. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road, their glow reflecting off the still wet pavement from an earlier shower. Tom had only been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for 3 months, having transferred from Pine Creek, a much smaller town about 50 miles away. Tom was still trying to find his footing in this new department. The faces, the streets, the routines, everything was different here. Back in Pine Creek, he knew everyone. Here in Oak Ridge, he was just another uniform in a sea of blue. His radio crackled with occasional chatter as he turned onto Henderson Avenue, a quiet residential street that connected to the busier part of town. Tom rolled down his window slightly, letting the cool night air fill the patrol car. It was just after 10 p.m. on a Friday night, and the streets were quieter than usual. Maybe the weather was keeping people home. As he approached the intersection with Fairview Road, Tom noticed a black sedan with slightly tinted windows roll through a stop sign. The car wasn't speeding recklessly, but the driver had definitely failed to come to a complete stop. Tom watched as the sedan continued down the road, now going about 5 miles over the speed limit. "Well, that's 2 violations right there," Tom muttered to himself as he flipped on his lights. The policy at Oak Ridge PD was clear: enforce traffic laws consistently, no exceptions. He'd been reminded of this during his orientation with Lieutenant Patel just last week. The sedan pulled over smoothly, no hesitation, which Tom took as a good sign. He radioed in the license plate and his location before stepping out of his patrol car. The night suddenly felt darker as he moved away from his headlights. Tom adjusted his belt and straightened his posture as he approached the vehicle, following the procedure he'd been taught at the academy years ago. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he scanned the back seat first, empty, and then moved toward the driver's side window. Inside was a middle-aged black man in casual clothes, a dark blue sweater from what Tom could see. The man's hands were visible on the steering wheel, another good sign. Something about the man's calm demeanor made Tom pause. Most people showed at least some nervousness when being pulled over. This man seemed completely at ease, almost expectant. Tom felt a strange flicker of unease, though he couldn't place why. "Evening, sir," Tom said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "License and registration, please." The man nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Of course, officer," he replied in a deep, measured voice. He moved his right hand slowly toward the glove compartment, narrating his movements. "I'm going to reach for my registration now." Tom's hand instinctively shifted closer to his belt as he watched the man retrieve the vehicle documents. It was a reflexive movement, one born from years of training and stories shared by other officers. The man seemed to notice the subtle movement but said nothing. "And now I'll get my license from my wallet," the man continued, reaching toward his back pocket with the same deliberate slowness. Tom accepted the offered documents, shining his flashlight on them. The license looked ordinary enough. A standard Oak Ridge driver's license with the man's photo clearly visible. But when Tom read the name and occupation, his blood ran cold. Chief Robert Washington. Oak Ridge Police Department. Tom's flashlight beam wavered slightly as he looked from the ID back to the man's face. The resemblance to the photo was unmistakable, but Tom hadn't recognized him because he never actually met the chief in person. Chief Washington had been away at a law enforcement conference during Tom's first weeks, and their paths simply hadn't crossed yet at the station. Tom swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of the sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He had just pulled over his boss's boss, the head of the entire police department. Tom stared at the license in his hand, then back at the man behind the wheel. The air between them seemed to thicken with tension. Chief Washington. The name echoed in his mind as he tried to figure out what to say next. "Is everything all right, Officer Bailey?" Chief Washington asked, his voice calm but firm. Tom's surprise must have shown on his face. The chief knew his name, even though they'd never met. Of course he would. He was the chief after all. "Sir, Tom cleared his throat, standing up straighter. "Chief Washington, I didn't recognize you. I apologize for the inconvenience." The chief studied him for a moment, his eyes reflecting the flashing blue and red lights from the patrol car. "No need to apologize for doing your job, Officer Bailey. May I ask why you pulled me over tonight?" Tom's training kicked in, helping him find his professional voice again. You rolled through the stop sign at Henderson and Fairview, sir, and you were going about 5 miles over the speed limit. Chief Washington nodded slowly. I see. He didn't make excuses or deny it. Instead, he looked thoughtfully at Tom. And what would you have done if I wasn't the chief? The question caught Tom off guard. Well, I would have issued a warning or possibly a citation, sir, depending on your driving record and other factors. A few raindrops began to fall, pattering softly on the roof of the cars. Chief Washington glanced up at the darkening sky, then back at Tom, who was getting wet standing outside the car. Officer Bailey, would you mind joining me for a cup of coffee? There's a diner about 2 blocks from here that stays open late. Tom blinked in confusion. This wasn't how he expected this traffic stop to go, sir. I'm not asking as your boss right now, the chief clarified. Just as someone who thinks we might have an important conversation ahead of us. You can follow me there in your patrol car. Tom nodded, still feeling off balance. Yes, sir. I'll meet you there. As he walked back to his patrol car, Tom's mind raced. Was he in trouble? Was this some kind of test? He radioed in that he was taking a short break and would be at Joe's diner if needed. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived. A sleepy-eyed waitress led them to a booth in the corner, away from the few other late-night customers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh glow that made Chief Washington look older than he had in the car. 2 coffees, please, the chief said to the waitress, who nodded and shuffled away. Tom sat across from his boss, trying not to fidget. He noticed things about the chief he hadn't seen during the traffic stop, the tired lines around his eyes, the slight gray at his temples, the wedding band on his left hand. You're probably wondering why I asked you here, Chief Washington began, folding his hands on the table. Yes, sir, Tom admitted. I could have shown you my badge right away and driven off. That would have been the easy thing to do. The chief paused as the waitress set down 2 steaming mugs of coffee between them. He waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. But I think we have an opportunity here, Officer Bailey. An opportunity to learn from each other. Tom wrapped his hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. I'm not sure I understand, sir. Chief Washington took a sip of his coffee before answering. In my 25 years on the force, I've been pulled over 14 times while off duty. He let that sink in for a moment. Only twice was I actually breaking any traffic laws. The implication hung in the air between them. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm not accusing you of anything, Bailey, the chief said, his tone softening. What I am doing is inviting you to have an honest conversation. When you approached my car tonight, I saw your hand move toward your weapon. It was subtle, maybe even unconscious, but I noticed it because I've seen it before. Tom opened his mouth to defend himself, then closed it. He had moved his hand closer to his belt, hadn't he? He hadn't even realized he was doing it at the time. Sir, Chief Washington held up a hand. Before you respond, I want you to know something. I didn't ask you here to reprimand you. I asked you here because I think you're a good officer who wants to do the right thing. And because good policing starts with honest reflection. The diner's old ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, barely moving the warm air around them. Tom stared into his coffee cup, watching the ripples form as a passing truck rumbled by outside. The chief's words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Honest reflection, Tom repeated quietly. He looked up at Chief Washington. I want to be a good cop, sir. That's all I've ever wanted. The chief nodded, his eyes kind but searching. I believe that, Bailey. Most people who join the force do it for the right reasons, but good intentions aren't always enough. The waitress appeared with a coffee pot, refilling their cups without a word, before moving on to the only other occupied table, where a tired-looking truck driver sat hunched over a plate of eggs. Tom took a sip of the fresh coffee, buying himself time to gather his thoughts. About my hand moving toward my weapon, he finally said, I didn't even realize I was doing it. That's exactly my point, Chief Washington replied. It's the things we do without thinking that often reveal the most about us, about the assumptions we carry. Tom felt a flush of defensiveness rise in his chest. With all due respect, sir, I was trained to be cautious during traffic stops. It's standard procedure. And did you follow that same procedure earlier tonight when you pulled over Mrs. Henderson for the same rolling stop? She's the mayor's wife, drives that red convertible. The chief's voice remained even, not accusatory. Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. Mrs. Henderson was a white woman in her 60s. He tried to remember if his hand had moved toward his weapon during that stop. He couldn't recall making that motion. I don't know, he admitted. Chief Washington nodded, as if Tom had confirmed something important. Let me tell you a story, Bailey. My first day as a rookie 25 years ago, my training officer was a guy named Pete Donnelly. Tough old-school cop, decorated veteran. We got a call about a break-in at a nice house in the suburbs. When we arrived, there was a black man in a suit standing in the front yard, looking upset. The chief paused, taking a sip of his coffee. Donnelly immediately drew his weapon, ordered the man to the ground. I followed his lead because he was my training officer. Turns out the man lived there. He was a doctor who had locked himself out and was trying to get in through a window. Chief Washington shook his head at the memory. The look on that man's face, lying face down on his own lawn, I still remember it. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's terrible, but things have changed since then, haven't they? Some things have, the chief agreed. But change doesn't just happen on its own. It happens when good people recognize problems and work to fix them. He leaned forward slightly. That's why I'm telling you this, Bailey. Not to make you feel bad, but because I see potential in you. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming against the diner's windows. The sound filled the silence as Tom considered the chief's words. What happened with Officer Donnelly? Tom asked finally. After that incident, Chief Washington's face softened slightly. He apologized to the homeowner, sincerely, and for the rest of his career, he made it his mission to train rookies differently than he had been trained. He became one of the best mentors in the department. The chief smiled faintly. He's the one who recommended me for my first promotion. Tom looked up, surprised. Really? People can change, Bailey. That's the point. But first, they have to see that change is needed. Chief Washington glanced at his watch. It's getting late. I should let you get back to your patrol. Wait, Tom said, more urgently than he'd intended. I want to understand better. What you're saying about assumptions and training, I want to learn. The chief studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. All right, he said finally. I have a proposal for you. Tomorrow at the station, I'm running a training session on community policing. I'd like you to join me, not as a participant, but as a co-presenter. Tom's eyes widened. Me? But I don't know anything about. You know what happened tonight? Chief Washington interrupted gently. And you're willing to talk about it honestly. That's exactly what we need. Tom stared at Chief Washington, his coffee forgotten and growing cold. Co-presenter? But sir, I'm the newest officer in the department. Nobody will take me seriously. That's exactly why it needs to be you, the chief replied, tapping his finger lightly on the table for emphasis. You're not entrenched in old habits yet. And what happened tonight is fresh, real. The waitress walked by, offering more coffee. Both men shook their heads. Outside, the rain had settled into a gentle patter against the windows, creating a soothing background rhythm to their conversation. I wouldn't know what to say, Tom admitted, running a hand through his short brown hair. Just tell the truth, Chief Washington said simply. That's all I'm asking. Share what went through your mind during that traffic stop. What you saw, what you assumed, what you felt when you realized who I was. Tom swallowed hard. Putting himself out there like that, admitting to potential bias in front of his colleagues, it made his stomach knot up just thinking about it. I'd be painting a target on my back, he said quietly. The chief leaned back against the red vinyl booth. You think so? Let me ask you something, Bailey. How many traffic stops have you done since joining Oak Ridge PD? Tom thought about it. 40, maybe 50. And how many of those led to searches of the vehicle? Tom shifted uncomfortably. I don't know exactly. Maybe 10 or 12. And of those searches, how many actually turned up anything illegal? Tom's discomfort grew. He knew the answer without having to count. 2, he said finally. One had an unregistered firearm, and one had some marijuana. Chief Washington nodded, not looking surprised. That's a lot of people being searched for no reason, wouldn't you say? We have to be thorough, Tom said defensively. If there's reasonable suspicion. What constitutes reasonable suspicion is exactly what we need to talk about, the chief interrupted gently. Because I think if you look at who you're pulling over, who you're searching, you might notice some patterns. Tom stared down at the table, tracing a water ring with his finger. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew what the chief was getting at. Most of the people he'd searched had been black or Hispanic men. He hadn't consciously targeted them. He'd just followed his instincts about who looked suspicious. I'm not saying you're a bad cop, Bailey, Chief Washington continued, his voice softening. I'm saying you're a human being with the same biases and blind spots we all have. The difference is whether we recognize them and try to do better. A tired-looking woman and her teenage son entered the diner, the bell above the door jingling. They took a booth near the front, both of them sneaking curious glances at the uniformed officer sitting with a well-dressed black man. Look at them, Chief Washington said quietly, nodding toward the new arrivals. What's going through their minds right now, seeing us here together? Tom watched as the woman whispered something to her son, who shrugged in response. They're probably wondering if you're in trouble, Tom suggested. Sitting with a cop late at night usually isn't a good sign. Chief Washington smiled slightly. Maybe. Or maybe they're wondering why a white officer is interrogating a black man in a diner at midnight. Tom hadn't considered that interpretation. The thought made him uncomfortable, but he could see how someone might view their meeting that way. Perspective matters, the chief said, reading Tom's expression. And that's what tomorrow's training is about, seeing situations from different perspectives. Tom took a deep breath. What time is the training? 9 a.m. Conference Room B. Chief Washington studied Tom's face. Does that mean you'll do it? Tom nodded slowly. Yeah, I'll do it. He wasn't entirely sure why he was agreeing, but something about the chief's straightforward manner made him want to rise to the occasion. The chief smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Good man. He pulled out his wallet and left a $10 bill on the table. Get some rest, Bailey. Tomorrow won't be easy, but it will be worthwhile. As they stood to leave, the chief extended his hand. Tom shook it, noticing the strength in the older man's grip. One more thing, Chief Washington said as they walked toward the door. When you tell the story tomorrow, don't leave anything out. Not the hand toward your weapon, not your surprise at seeing my ID. The only way this works is with complete honesty. Tom nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. Yes, sir. Complete honesty. As they stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. Tom watched the chief walk to his car, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. And why, despite his nervousness, he felt like he was finally doing something important. The blonde recruit raised her hand again. So what happened after that night? With you two, I mean. Tom and the chief exchanged a glance, smiling slightly at the memory. Well, Tom said, I thought my career might be over. Instead, the chief gave me the biggest opportunity of my life. And Officer Bailey ran with it, Chief Washington added. He's now our department's community relations liaison in addition to his patrol duties. The program we developed has been adopted by 3 neighboring departments, and next month we're presenting it at the State Police Conference. As the session continued, Tom felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over him. 6 months ago, he'd been embarrassed and afraid. Now he stood tall, knowing that one difficult night had led to real change, not just for him, but for the entire department. Later, as the recruits filed out for their lunch break, Chief Washington clapped Tom on the shoulder. You did good in there, Bailey. Thanks, Chief. Tom gathered his materials. You know, sometimes I think about what would have happened if you'd just shown me your badge right away that night. If you pulled rank and driven off. The chief shook his head. Then we'd both have missed an opportunity. An opportunity, Tom repeated, thinking about how much had changed. That's what you called it that night at the diner. I thought you were crazy at the time. And now? Chief Washington asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Tom looked out at the academy yard, where the recruits were gathering, their future as officers still ahead of them. Now I think it might have been the most important traffic stop of my career. The chief laughed. Mine too, Bailey. Mine too. Tom barely slept that night. He tossed and turned in his small apartment, replaying the traffic stop and diner conversation in his mind. By the time his alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., he had already been awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling. He arrived at the station 45 minutes early, his uniform pressed and boots shined to perfection. The morning shift was just starting, officers grabbing coffee and chatting before roll call. A few nodded at Tom as he passed, but most barely noticed him, still the new guy, still somewhat invisible. Tom made his way to conference room B, surprised to find the door already open. Inside, Chief Washington was arranging chairs in a circle rather than the usual classroom-style rows. He looked up when Tom entered. "Morning, Bailey. You're early." "Couldn't sleep, sir," Tom admitted. The chief smiled slightly. "That makes two of us." He gestured to a cardboard tray of coffee cups. "Help yourself. The good stuff from Greg's, not the station sludge." Tom took a cup gratefully. "Thanks." He hesitated, then asked, "How many people will be here?" "I've made it mandatory for all shift supervisors and training officers. About 15 in total." The chief moved another chair into place, plus a few who requested to attend after hearing about it. Tom nearly choked on his coffee. People have heard about it already. Small department, big gossip. Chief Washington shrugged. Word gets around when the chief pulls over his newest officer. Tom's face grew hot. "Great," he muttered. "Relax, Bailey. This isn't about embarrassing you." The chief paused, his chair arranging. "It's about using a real moment to spark change. That's more valuable than any training video or manual." Over the next half hour, officers began filtering in. Tom recognized some from his shifts, others only from passing in the hallways. Lieutenant Patel arrived, giving Tom a curious look before taking a seat. Sergeant Wilson, Tom's direct supervisor, came in last, looking annoyed at having his morning routine disrupted. Chief Washington closed the door at exactly 9 o'clock. "Thank you all for being here," he began, standing in the center of the circle. "Instead of our scheduled community policing review, we're going to have a different conversation today." He glanced at Tom. "Officer Bailey and I had an interesting encounter last night that I think we can all learn from." All eyes turned to Tom, who suddenly felt like he might be sick. The chief nodded encouragingly. Tom began awkwardly. "I was on patrol last night around 10 p.m. I pulled over a black sedan for rolling through a stop sign and going a bit over the speed limit." Lieutenant Patel raised an eyebrow. "And this is special because the driver was Chief Washington," Tom said. The room went completely silent. "And I didn't know it was him until I saw his ID. He was just—" Tom hesitated, then forced himself to continue honestly. "He was just a black man in a nice car to me." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sergeant Wilson crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Officer Bailey," the chief said, taking over smoothly, "tell them what happened as you approached my vehicle." Tom swallowed hard. "I followed protocol. Asked for license and registration, but he took a deep breath. I'd also moved my hand closer to my weapon. Not drawing it, just positioning myself, being ready." "And you do that for every traffic stop?" Chief Washington asked. "Aye." Tom looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his fellow officers. Some looked away. Others nodded slightly, recognizing the behavior in themselves. "No," he admitted finally, "not every stop." "When do you do it?" The chief pressed gently. The room felt too warm, too crowded. Tom loosened his collar slightly. "When I feel there might be a threat." "And what made you feel threatened in this case?" Tom knew the answer, but saying it out loud in front of everyone, that was different. He looked at the chief, who nodded encouragingly. "You were a black man in a nice car in that neighborhood at night," Tom said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "And I made assumptions based on that." No one spoke. Some officers stared at the floor. Others looked at Tom with expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort to quiet respect. "Thank you for your honesty," Chief Washington said, his voice warm with approval. "That's step one. Acknowledging the reality." He addressed the room. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here because what Officer Bailey experienced is something most of us have done at some point." Sergeant Wilson cleared his throat. "With all due respect, sir, officers have to be cautious. It's about survival." "Absolutely," the chief agreed. But there's a difference between caution and bias, and that difference can mean life or death for civilians and for officers. He moved to the center of the circle. Let me tell you about my 25 years on the force and what it's been like to be both a black man and a police officer in this community. The room fell silent as Chief Washington stood in the center of the circle. Every eye was fixed on him, some curious, some defensive, all attentive. Tom sat with his hands clasped tightly, still feeling exposed after his confession, but also strangely relieved. "The first time I was pulled over while off duty," Chief Washington began, "I was 23. Just graduated from the police academy, so proud of my badge that I kept it in my pocket even when I wasn't working." He smiled faintly at the memory. "I was driving my mom's old Buick, nothing fancy, got pulled over for a broken taillight I didn't know about." He paced slowly around the inner edge of the circle. "When the officer approached, I told him I was on the force, showed him my badge." Know what he said? The chief paused. He said, "Sure you are," and made me get out of the car anyway. Patted me down right there on the side of the road. Lieutenant Patel shook her head, frowning. "That was a long time ago, though. Things have changed." "Have they?" the chief asked mildly. "In the past year alone, I've been pulled over 3 times while driving my personal vehicle. Each time, I was asked if the car belonged to me." A younger officer spoke up. "But sir, if there's a pattern of vehicle theft in certain areas—" "I was in my own neighborhood," Chief Washington interrupted gently. "2 blocks from my house, where I've lived for 11 years. The officer fell silent. Sergeant Wilson shifted in his chair, his arms still crossed but his expression less rigid than before. "The point isn't to make anyone feel guilty," the chief continued. "The point is to recognize that we all carry these assumptions with us. They're like water to fish, so normal we don't even notice them." He turned to Tom. "Officer Bailey, when you realized who I was, what went through your mind?" Tom straightened in his chair. "Honestly, first, I was embarrassed, then scared I might be in trouble." He hesitated. "But later, at the diner, I started thinking about other traffic stops I've done, wondering if I've been treating people differently without realizing it." Chief Washington nodded approvingly. "That self-reflection is exactly what we need more of." He addressed the whole room again. "Every one of us has biases. It's not about being a bad person, it's about being human. But as officers, our biases can have serious consequences." The room was quiet as this sank in. Outside the conference room windows, the morning sun broke through the clouds, sending streaks of light across the circle of officers. "I've been pulled over 17 times in my 25 years on the force," the chief said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Only 3 of those stops resulted in actual citations for legitimate violations. 3 out of 17. Several officers exchanged glances. Even Sergeant Wilson uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "But here's what I want you to understand," the chief continued. "Each time, the officer was just doing what they thought was right, following their training, their instincts. The problem isn't individual officers, it's the patterns we don't see until someone points them out." He walked over to a whiteboard and picked up a marker. "Let's try something. Without naming specific officers, I want each of you to think about your last 10 traffic stops. How many of those drivers were people of color? How many resulted in searches? And of those searches, how many turned up anything illegal?" The room grew tense as officers mentally calculated their numbers. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were realizing. "We don't need to share these numbers out loud," the chief assured them. "But I want you to keep them in mind as we move forward with this conversation." He drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard. Concentric circles with awareness in the center, then training, policy, and culture in the outer rings. "Change starts with awareness," he said, tapping the center circle. "What Officer Bailey did last night, recognizing his automatic reactions, that's the first step. From there, we can look at our training, our policies, and ultimately, our departmental culture." Tom felt a surprising surge of pride at being singled out this way. What had begun as embarrassment was turning into something meaningful. Officer Chen, a 10-year veteran, raised her hand. "I appreciate what you're saying, Chief, but we can't ignore crime statistics either. Some neighborhoods do have higher crime rates." "Absolutely right," Chief Washington nodded. Good policing means using all the information available to us, but it also means questioning whether our enforcement is creating some of those statistics. He set down the marker and faced the group again. Let me be clear. I'm not asking anyone to stop being vigilant or to ignore genuine warning signs. I'm asking you to add one more step to your process. Ask yourself, would I be responding the same way if this person looked different? The question hung in the air. Some officers nodded slowly, others looked skeptical but thoughtful. That's all for today, the chief said, checking his watch. But this conversation isn't over. I'm instituting a new program starting next week, and I'd like Officer Bailey to help me lead it. Tom's head snapped up in surprise. Me, sir. 6 months later, Tom stood at the front of the Oak Ridge Police Academy classroom, watching 30 fresh-faced recruits settle into their seats. The room buzzed with nervous energy. These rookies were just 2 weeks into their training, still shiny and new, eager to learn, but unsure what to expect. Good morning, Tom said, his voice steady and confident. It no longer felt strange to be leading these sessions. I'm Officer Tom Bailey, and today we're going to talk about something that won't be in your textbooks. The door at the back of the room opened, and Chief Washington walked in. The recruits straightened instinctively in their chairs. The chief nodded at Tom to continue. 6 months ago, Tom said, I pulled over my boss without knowing it. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Sounds like the start of a bad joke, right? But what happened next changed the way I think about policing. Tom paced slowly across the front of the room, making eye contact with different recruits. I was new to the department, just like you are now. Thought I knew what I was doing. Thought I was one of the good ones. He paused. And then a simple traffic stop showed me something about myself I hadn't wanted to see. For the next 20 minutes, Tom walked the recruits through that night. The traffic stop, his hand moving toward his weapon, the revelation at seeing the chief's ID, and the conversation at the diner. He held nothing back, describing his defensiveness and eventual realization with complete honesty. One of the recruits, a young woman with short blonde hair, raised her hand. Sir, with respect, why are you telling us this? Aren't we supposed to be cautious during traffic stops? Absolutely, Tom nodded. But there's a difference between caution and bias. I didn't know that difference 6 months ago. My goal is to help you understand it now, before you develop bad habits that might take years to break. Chief Washington stepped forward then. Officer Bailey is being modest, he said. What started as a single conversation has grown into something much bigger. He gestured to Tom. Show them the numbers. Tom clicked through to the next slide in his presentation. A graph appeared on the screen, showing a steady downward trend. These are our department's civilian complaint statistics, Tom explained. Down 42% in the last 6 months. Excessive force complaints down 38%. And here's the interesting part, our arrest numbers haven't dropped. We're still enforcing the law, still getting results. We're just doing it differently. Another recruit raised his hand. How exactly? What did you change? Chief Washington answered, we implemented what we call the self-check program. Before officers approach a vehicle or a suspect, they take a 3-second pause to ask themselves a simple question. Would I respond the same way if this person looked different? 3 seconds doesn't sound like much, Tom added, but it's enough time to catch yourself if you're acting on bias instead of facts. The chief moved to stand beside Tom. We also changed how we pair officers for patrol, increased community engagement events, and revised our training, starting with sessions like this one. A tall recruit in the back row spoke up. No offense, but this sounds like a lot of work just because one officer made a mistake. Tom smiled. It wasn't just me. When we started looking at the data, we found patterns across the whole department. Traffic stops, searches, use of force, all showed disparities we couldn't explain by crime rates alone. And here's what might surprise you, Chief Washington said. Officer safety incidents are down 27%. Turns out, when officers approach situations with clear heads instead of preconceived notions, everyone is safer.